Welcome to episode 2 of The Circle Jerk. I'm your host, James Carrion. In episode 1, I laid out a framework for why UFOs are making headlines today. Between 2017 and 2023, the United States government went from 70 years of institutional silence on UFOs to congressional hearings, whistleblower testimony under oath, landmark legislation, and a Senate Majority Leader on the floor of Congress demanding to know where the craft are. All of it coordinated, clean, each element supporting the next. I introduce you to the network behind that story: journalists, attorneys, former intelligence officials, and scientists who were deeply embedded in UFO advocacy long before UFO whistleblower David Grush appeared on the scene. I walked you through how this story was built, timed, and delivered, from a UFO conference in June 2022 through the Washington Post fact-checking process that Keenan Blumenthal chose not to wait for, to the debrief, to a Nexstar broadcast platform, to the floor of the United States Congress with the network physically present in the hearing room. I called that a circle jerk in its most structurally precise definition, and I offered 3 explanations for what that means: a liberation operation run by patriots, a sincere community of true believers caught in circular reporting, or a limited hangout delivered through an unwitting network serving purposes we haven't identified yet. Any one of these 3 could be the truth. Today, we start pulling on the threads. In intelligence analysis, there's a discipline called Analysis of Competing Hypotheses, formalized by a CIA analyst named Richard Hoyer. The idea is straightforward and is harder to practice than it sounds. When you're looking at a body of evidence, the natural human tendency is to find the explanation that fits and to stop looking. What ACH forces you to do instead is something more uncomfortable. You take every hypothesis that could explain the evidence, including the ones you don't want to be true, including the ones that feel wrong, including the ones that would be inconvenient, and you hold them all simultaneously. You test each one against the evidence. You ask not which hypothesis the evidence supports, but which hypothesis the evidence can eliminate. The goal is not to find the answer you're looking for. The goal is to find the answer you cannot disprove. I want to apply that discipline to what we just walked through. I can think of 3 explanations for the Grush operation, for the network: the timing, the media strategy, the congressional hearing, all of it. And the uncomfortable truth is that the evidence we currently have does not eliminate any of them. So let's go through them seriously, one at a time, because each one deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. Possibility 1. The UFO advocates are right, and this is how you fight a cover-up. Let's start here, because this is the hypothesis the disclosure advocates are asking you to accept. And it deserves a fair hearing before we examine the alternatives. Suppose it's true. Suppose the United States government has, since at least 1947, been in possession of recovered non-human technology, recovered craft, possibly recovered biological material, held in special access programs so compartmentalized that even senior elected officials with the highest clearances can't access them. Managed not through normal government channels, but through defense contractors operating under secrecy provisions that place them outside normal congressional oversight. If that's true, and I mean really true, then what would an honest person inside that system do? You can't just hold a press conference. The programs are classified at a level that makes unauthorized disclosure a federal crime. The institutional resistance isn't bureaucratic inertia. It's the weight of 75 years of compartmentalization, enforced by legal mechanisms specifically designed to survive any individual's conscience. You can't go to the press cold. A reporter without a credentialed source has nothing. A claim without documentation is a conspiracy theory. You need someone whose biography makes the story impossible to dismiss. You need congressional champions. You need journalists who understand the subject. You need legal representation. You need scientists who can speak to the physical evidence in terms the academic community respects. In other words, if the cover-up is real, you need exactly the network that formed around David Grush. The coordination isn't suspicious in this scenario. The coordination is necessary. The pre-existing relationships aren't a red flag. They're the infrastructure that makes a liberation operation possible. You don't build that network after the whistleblower appears. You build it over decades through shared conviction and shared work, precisely so that when the right asset comes forward, the system is ready to receive them. In this reading, what I described as a circle jerk is actually the most rational possible response to an irrational situation. It looks like a coordinated information operation because it is one, run by people who believe they are fighting for the most consequential truth in human history against an institutional apparatus that has successfully suppressed that truth for longer than most of them have been alive. If that's true, the people in this network are heroes. Possibility 2. The UFO advocates believe it, but they're wrong. This one is in some ways the most psychologically interesting of the three. Imagine a network of people, intelligent people, credentialed people, people with genuine military and intelligence backgrounds, who have spent years, in some cases their entire adult lives, immersed in the UFO subject. They believe with genuine conviction that a cover-up exists, and they have found each other. Now watch what happens inside that network. Person A has a source who says X. Person B has a source who says something consistent with X. Person A's source gains credibility because Person B's independent source seems to corroborate them. Person B's source gains credibility because Person A's source seems to corroborate them. Person C, who trusts both A and B, incorporates both accounts into their own understanding of the subject. Their credibility now reinforces the credibility of A and B. From inside the network, this looks like independent corroboration. Multiple sources, multiple disciplines, all pointing in the same direction. From outside the network, it looks like something else. It looks like a closed loop where the same foundational claims circulate through multiple credentialed nodes, gaining apparent corroboration with each pass, not because independent evidence is accumulating, but because the same belief is being reflected back from multiple directions simultaneously. It has a name in intelligence analysis, a precise one: circular reporting. And it's not a fringe critique. It's the exact language the Pentagon's own UAP investigation office used in their 2024 historical review. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the office Congress created specifically to get to the bottom of these claims. Arrow's finding was that these claims are, in large part, the result of circular reporting from a group of individuals who believe this to be the case, despite the lack of any evidence. And they went further. They noted that modern instances of these claims largely stem from a consistent group of individuals involved in various UAP-related endeavors since at least 2009. Arrow looked at the network, traced the claims back through it, and concluded that what looks like independent corroboration from multiple credentialed sources is actually the same belief cycling through the same group of people for 15 years. That is not a dismissal of the phenomenon. That is a structural observation about the information this analytical framework is designed to surface. Now add the intelligence community's Inspector General. The ICIG's credibility and urgency determination covered two things: whether Grush had been retaliated against for coming forward, and whether elements of the intelligence community had improperly withheld UFO-related information from Congress. Both allegations were found credible and urgent, both serious, both warranting congressional notification. What it did not cover, and what Grush's own legal team explicitly confirmed, was the substance of the underlying claim, whether the government actually possesses recovered non-human craft. That question was, in the words of Compass Rose Legal Group, the firm that filed the complaint on Grush's behalf, always outside the scope of their representation. The ICIG finding means this person appears to have been retaliated against, and something appears to have been improperly withheld from Congress. It does not mean the government has alien spacecraft. Those are different things. Credible and urgent is a legal checkbox, not a verdict. It means this complaint gets forwarded. That's it. What happened next was a classic laundering of credibility. The procedural finding got retransmitted as substantive validation, and by the time it reached social media, it had become the government's own inspector general confirmed it. That's not what happened. Possibility 3. It's a limited hangout. You remember how this works. You sacrifice a portion of the truth to protect the larger truth behind it. You volunteer what you were going to lose anyway and make the more sensitive material seem boring by comparison. Now apply that to UFOs. Here's the critical point about this possibility. The limited hangout doesn't require the people delivering it to know they're delivering it. The most effective version of this operation does not involve calling up Christopher Mellon and saying, "Hey, Chris, we need you to run a limited hangout." It doesn't involve planting Grush as a knowing asset. It doesn't require any of the people in the network to be lying or compromised or even aware that they're being used. It requires giving true believers real information selectively. Carefully chosen fragments of a larger picture that is enough to be genuinely revelatory and enough to pass any verification the network is capable of performing. Enough to generate authentic conviction in people whose authentic conviction is exactly what makes them effective vehicles. And the network I described, pre-existing, credentialed, deeply committed with established media relationships and congressional access, is the ideal delivery mechanism for exactly this kind of operation. You don't build that network, it already exists. You identify it, cultivate it, feed it what you want in the public domain, and let it do the rest. The circle jerk in this possibility is not a bug, it's a feature. The closed loop isn't an accident of like-minded people finding each other. It's a feature of an information architecture specifically designed to circulate a narrative through enough credentialed nodes that it arrives at congressional testimony, appearing to have been independently verified. Now I want to put all three of these on the table at the same time. A genuine liberation operation run by patriots fighting a 75-year institutional cover-up of the most consequential secret in human history. A sincere community of true believers caught in circular reporting, mutually validating each other's convictions with the best of intentions. A limited hangout delivered through an unwitting network of genuine advocates, serving purposes that have nothing to do with the truth they believe they're disclosing. From the outside, all three of these look identical. The network structure is the same. The media strategy is the same. The congressional hearing is the same. The credentialed insiders are the same. The sympathetic journalists are the same. The ICIG determination is the same. Everything that is publicly observable about the Grush operation is equally consistent with all three hypotheses. In analysis of competing hypotheses, when your evidence is equally consistent with all of your hypotheses, that is not a finding. That is a call for more evidence. And there's only one category of evidence that could distinguish between these three possibilities. Not testimony, because testimony is consistent with all three. Not congressional hearings. Congressional hearings are consistent with all three. Not inspector general determinations about complaint processes, consistent with all three. Not the credentials of the people making the claims, consistent with all three. What can distinguish between the three possibilities is physical, verifiable, independent evidence. A recovered craft, material of non-terrestrial origin subjected to independent scientific analysis. Biological material that cannot be explained by known biology. Something that exists outside the network, outside the testimony, outside the circle. Something that any qualified scientist anywhere in the world can examine and reach the same conclusion about. That's the test. That's the only test. And after 6 years of congressional hearings, after landmark legislation, after sworn testimony from decorated veterans, after an inspector general determination, after a Senate Majority Leader called it a constitutional crisis, after a presidential directive, we still don't have it. Not one piece. That absence is not proof that the cover-up is false. A successful cover-up, by definition, would look exactly like this. But it is the most important fact in this entire conversation. And it's the one that almost nobody in the disclosure network wants to talk about. There are two ways to cover the UFO disclosure story, and the American media has been doing both of them badly. The first way is dismissal. The story is too strange, the claimants too fringe, the whole subject too radioactive for a serious journalist to touch. So you don't touch it. You assign it to the science desk with a slightly condescending headline, and you move on. The second way is advocacy. The phenomenon is real. The cover-up is real. The witnesses are credible. The disclosure is coming. You are a champion for truth against an institutional apparatus that has been lying to the American public for 75 years. Every new witness corroborates the story. Every congressional hearing is a victory. Every setback is evidence of how deep the resistance goes. Both of these are failures of journalism, and neither of them is what this show is going to do. What I'm interested in are the questions that fall between dismissal and advocacy. The questions a real investigation would actually ask. Let me tell you what those questions are. First question, who controls the access? Every journalist who has broken significant UFO news in the past decade has done so through the same small network of gatekeepers. Every congressional staffer working on UFO legislation has relationships with the same small group of advocates. Every researcher who wants to go deeper has to go through the same doors. What happens to people who try to go around those doors? I've watched over years of following this subject. What happens to journalists and researchers who ask uncomfortable questions from outside the network? They get dismissed as disinformation agents. They get accused of working for interests that want to suppress the truth. The criticism itself becomes evidence for the cover-up, because of course the forces trying to suppress the story would send people to undermine the credible investigators. Every challenge to the narrative becomes, within the logic of the system, more evidence for the narrative. Former Aero director Sean Kirkpatrick experienced this directly after the 2024 historical report. Elizondo and others in the network accused him of running a disinformation operation. It's an example of what the philosopher Karl Popper called an unfalsifiable hypothesis, a belief system structured so that no possible evidence can disprove it. I want to know what investigative journalism looks like when it tries to go around the gatekeepers. I want to know whether the story holds up when you pull on it from directions the network didn't anticipate. Second question, why these journalists? Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal are credentialed. Blumenthal was part of a team that won a Pulitzer. Kean has spent 15 years building sources on the subject. Their credentials are real. But they were UFO believers before David Grush walked into their lives. Kean wrote a book in 2010 arguing that the UFO phenomena is real, and the government is hiding it. Blumenthal had been working on UFO stories for years before the 2017 ATIP revelation. These are not neutral investigators who followed the evidence to an unexpected conclusion. These are advocates who found a source whose story confirmed what they already believed. Advocacy journalism is a real thing, and it has broken real stories, but it is different from independent investigation. And the distinction matters enormously when you're evaluating the evidentiary weight of a story. Where are the reporters with no prior investment in the outcome? Reporters willing to publish a story that says, we investigated and the evidence doesn't hold up. Not because they're debunkers, but because they actually follow the evidence wherever it led. Third question. What did the ICIG actually find? Credible and urgent. Those two words have been repeated thousands of times since July 2023, as though they constitute governmental confirmation that Grush's underlying claims are true. They don't. And the gap between what the ICIG determination actually means and what it has been reported to mean is one of the more significant evidentiary sleight of hands in this entire story. I want to go through the legal text. I want to talk to people who understand the Inspector General mechanism. I want to establish clearly, on the record, with sources, exactly what was assessed, how it was assessed, and what conclusions can and cannot legitimately be drawn from it. Because if the foundational piece of evidence that took this story to Congress doesn't mean what everyone says it means, that matters. That matters a great deal. And the fourth question, the one that underlies all the others. Where is the physical evidence? 6 years, congressional subpoena power, a sitting Senate Majority Leader who called this situation a constitutional crisis, a president who signed a disclosure directive, the most sustained political push for government transparency on a single subject in recent American history. And still, nothing. Not one object, not one material sample, not one piece of recovered technology submitted to independent scientific analysis. The disclosure advocates have an answer for this. The programs are so deeply buried, so thoroughly compartmentalized, so protected by legal mechanisms specifically designed to survive any oversight effort, that even the most aggressive congressional intervention can't reach them. That may be true. A successful cover-up would look exactly like that. But the complete absence of physical evidence, after this much effort, is the most important unanswered question in this entire subject. And it is the question the Disclosure Network has the least satisfying answer for. These are the questions the Circle Jerk is going to pursue. Not to debunk, not to advocate, to investigate. I want to speak directly now to the people I've named in this and the first episode. David Grush, Luis Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, Leslie Keene, Ralph Blumenthal, Daniel Sheehan, Dr. Gary Nolan, Ryan Graves, David Fravor, Tim Burchett. Every person whose name has appeared in the source timeline I walk through. Add to those names former Congressman Matt Gaetz and current Congresswoman Ana Paulina Luna, who have their own congressional UFO connection. I have named you. In some cases, I've said things about the structure of your operation that you may find unfair or incomplete or frustrating. I want to address that directly. I have not called you liars, not one of you. I have not said the UFO phenomena isn't real. The evidence that something genuinely anomalous has been observed in controlled airspace by trained military personnel is at this point substantial. I take it seriously. This show takes it seriously. What I have said, and what I will continue to say, is that the structure of how this story was built, coordinated, and released into the public domain deserves the same analytical scrutiny that any organized information operation deserves. Not because I've concluded it's illegitimate, but because that scrutiny is what honest investigation requires. If your story holds up under that scrutiny, you should want this conversation. The questions I want to ask you are not the questions you've been asked before. I want to ask Christopher Mellon, Who gave you the Navy gun camera videos in that Pentagon parking lot? And what did they ask for in return? I want to ask George Knapp. In 30 years of UFO reporting, have you ever followed a lead that took you away from the cover-up hypothesis rather than toward it? What happened to those leads? I want to ask Leslie Keene, what would it take to convince you that the story isn't what you believe it is? What evidence, if it emerged, would change your mind? I want to ask David Grush. The ICIG found your complaint credible and urgent as a complaint. What physical evidence have you personally examined that underlies the claim in that complaint? These are serious questions, and they deserve serious answers. And the American public, who has been following the story in some form since 1947, deserves to hear those answers out loud. So here's my standing invitation, publicly on the record. Every person named on this podcast, every congressional champion, every journalist, every insider, every witness, I want you on the show, not to ambush you, not to catch you in a contradiction, to have the conversation that the UFO disclosure story has never had with someone who is neither a true believer nor a dismissive skeptic. My contact information is on the show's website, thecirclejerk.info. My sourcing for everything in this episode is there too. Check it and correct it if I'm wrong. And then come on the show and tell me what I'm missing. I'll be here. I told you at the end of episode 1 that I was going to try to disprove the limited hangout hypothesis. I told you I was going to pull on the threads. Here's what I can tell you after pulling on them, at least to this point. The 3 possibilities I laid out are still standing. The evidence has not eliminated any of them. What the ACH framework demands, physical, verifiable, independent evidence, still does not exist. And the network, the timing, the media architecture, the congressional reception, all of it remains equally consistent with a liberation operation, a closed loop of sincere true believers, or a limited hangout. That is not a failure of the analysis. That is the analysis doing exactly what it's supposed to do, refusing to reach a conclusion the evidence doesn't support. But the threads do point somewhere. Not to David Grush, not to the 2017 New York Times story, not even to ATIP. They point back further, to a ranch in Utah, to a parking lot in Las Vegas, to a television broadcast in 1989. The question the series is now going to ask is not only whether the government has recovered non-human craft, it's who built the story that made you believe they might, and what that story has been protecting for 30 years. I have been inside this architecture. I have signed the contracts. I have sat in the rooms. I have watched this narrative being built layer by layer, decade by decade, by people I know through channels I can trace. I'm going back to the beginning, to Skinwalker Ranch, Bob Lazar, and the people who connected them, the money that followed, and the question that has been sitting at the center of all of it, unanswered since before most of you started paying attention. Who benefits from 30 years of this specific narrative existing in American public consciousness? That's episode 3. This is The Circle Jerk.